Last week we talked about the three guys that showed up at at Abraham's tent, and so what we're going to do this week is we're going to talk about some of the things that happened after that. But I'm not going to dwell on a lot of them. I'm going to try to move us along because I don't want us to get bogged down. It's easy to stay in one place. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But next week, I want to tell you, we're going to talk about, and it comes in line with this, what's going on today. Why are we facing what we're facing today? Why are we almost looking at the TV and saying, what country is this? Why are we doing this? Well, there's an answer. And it's always where it's always been in the Bible. So today, let's start out with what happened after those three guys came. You know, Jesus showed up in one of his Christophanies and told Abraham, yeah, in a year, you're going to have a little boy. And Sarah laughed. That's what we talked about last week. So after all that's done, there was two other guys with Jesus at that time, and they were angels, and they went down to Sodom. That's where Lot was, and you know the story, Sodom and Gomorrah. After that was over with, Lot had two daughters. They went off with him. Of course, his wife turned into a pillar of salt. And out of the strangest things, the two daughters decided, well, we don't have any more relatives. We don't have any more of our people. We're going to have some babies somehow. And so, as you know, the story goes, they got Lot drunk and their dad. And so they each, the oldest and the youngest, each had children from him, and one became the Moabite nation. Yeah, wow. Can you figure that? The other were the Ammonites. So out of this sprang two enemies to God's people. The next thing that happens in the sequence that goes along is another Abimelech moment. You go to what we started out with, and we said, boy, this is a soap opera. But here we are, and you know, the best I can tell, Abimelech might have been a title, not a name of somebody, because he's showing up way too many times. But Abimelech, you know, Abraham pulls the same thing. Hey, Sarah's my sister. Abimelech takes her. God crushes him, and he says, why'd you do this to me? And so out of it, Abraham gets richer and richer from all the stuff that they're giving him. Lo and behold, the promise that God made to Abraham comes true. Isaac is born. Sarah says, I've had enough of Hagar. Send her away with Ishmael. Well, Ishmael's a little older now. He goes away. God confronts Hagar again and said, don't worry about it. Ishmael's going to be the father of a great nation, of many people. And then something really strange happens. You know, Isaac grows up, and he may have been about 15 years old. And God says, hey, Abraham, take Isaac, go to this certain place and sacrifice him to me. After all of this that we've been through, all these promises, and the age of Abraham and Sarah, hey, sacrifice him. But we've got to understand something. Abraham's thinking to himself, look, I've been through all these things. God's always taking care of me. If he says he's going to do that, he will provide a way. I don't, either he's going to give me another son, or but he's going to keep his promise. Do we think that? Sometimes it doesn't turn out the way we want it to, but do we always think that God's going to live up to what he's promised us? There's a book written right now, just a small book. I don't know. I think it's by David Jeremiah. And it's all about God's promises. God, God promises these things. He's never failed. So they go off to this mountain. And we'll stop here just a second, because this is another Christophany. This is another picture of Christ in the Old Testament. So they're up on this mountain. Abraham's got Isaac tied to a bunch of sticks, and he's going to sacrifice him. And he has a knife, and he's about to raise the knife and kill the sacrifice. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven. The angel of the Lord, not an angel of the Lord, the angel of the Lord spoke from heaven and said, Abraham. Abraham says, here I am. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked up, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, because the Lord provided. But then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done the thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and the sand which is on the seashore, and seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men that were waiting down at the bottom of the mountain, and arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived there. Now, it came to pass, and I'm not sure why they stuck this in here, because it's telling us something that's really not relative to what we're talking about. But in lineage, it is. Now it came about after these things that it was told to Abraham, saying, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Nahor, of course, as we started this whole thing out, went with Abraham and his father, and they went to Haran and settled there. Then they came down as Abraham was called. But this is interesting that they're saying, hey, your brother's got some kids now. From a standpoint of genealogy, Ancestors.com, I bet you didn't know this one. Nahor had two sons. The first son was born, and they named him Uz. The second one was born, and they named him Buzz. Now, if you ever wonder why Buzz got his name, it's genealogy. It's in the Bible. I know Linda's going, no, that's not the way he got it, but I'm just kidding. It was funny when I read that. I thought, well, Buzz has some ancestors back in the Old Testament. Okay, I digress. So here we are, and Sarah's had the promised child, and they've gone through the sacrifice, and finally Sarah dies. She's 127 years old. But before this happens, both Sarah and Abraham, they don't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite. So they send us, Abraham makes his servant swear to him that he will do what Abraham tells him, and he sends his servant to Nahor. That's Abraham's brother. And he's going after a wife for Isaac. Here's a strange thing that I see in this. Abraham was this giant in history. And the Jews lived by the fact that they would say that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Isaac wasn't a giant. Isaac was mediocre. Isaac didn't do any great things. So they sent after Isaac a wife, and that wife was the daughter of Abraham's brother. You know, when you get out of the Abraham-Sarah soap opera, then you hit the sequel. And here comes the sequel, which is Isaac and Rebekah. So the servant went down there and he saw Rebekah. And funny thing, he gave her gifts. One of those gifts was a nose ring. Now, somewhere along the way, I have read so much stuff that somebody said that he gave her a bone for her nose. But I think it was the nose ring that they were talking about. He gave her a bunch of jewelry and he gave her all kinds of gifts. And so she comes back and she sees Isaac. She comes back with the servant. She sees Isaac out in the field coming toward them. And she says, "Who is that man?" to the servant. The servant said, "That is my master." Why did he call Isaac master and, not Abraham master? Because Abraham had already given everything he had over to Isaac. Because you see, after Sarah died, Abraham married again, and he had a bunch of kids, and he gave them all gifts, and he sent them to the east to get them away from Isaac, and then he gave everything to Isaac. Saga continues. Isaac prays to God for children because Rebekah can't have any. But something mysterious happens. It's almost just like the same story. You can't have a baby. I'm telling you, have a baby. You're going to have these descendants are going to last forever. You're going to be a great nation. I'm going to prosper you. And the same thing. But Isaac prays this prayer, and lo and behold, Rebekah gets pregnant. And it's with twins. So God comes to Rebekah and he tells her, he said, the Lord answered him, which is Isaac saying, "Please give us a baby." And he says to Rebekah, his wife, because she had conceived, "But the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is so, why then am I this way? Why are these babies kicking me so hard? Why are these babies squirming around and fighting in my womb? 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body, and one people will be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Hang on to that prophecy right there, because coming along, that's going to mean a lot. When the days had come for her to deliver, there were twins in her womb, and now the first one came out, and he was red and hairy. And they named him Esau. And afterward his brother came forth, and with his hand he reached out and grabbed Esau's heel. So his name became Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to these twins. Now I'm going to skip over a little bit here because I think you know it, but I'll refer back to it. Don't worry. The boys grow up. Isaac's a wild man. Well, let me back up. Boys grow up. Esau's a wild man. And he decides that he's going to take a wife. He was about 40 years old at this time. So he goes to the Hittite country, takes 2 wives. That didn't make Isaac and Rebekah very happy at all. They didn't want him to do that, but he did whatever he wanted to do. And then came Jacob's deception. And we all know that story. Bowl soup, and birthright and inheritance and all that. But we'll come back to that too. So what happened was, after all of that, Esau would, since he got his birthright stolen, he's going to kill Jacob. So Rebekah, who was pretty crafty and shrewd herself, decided that she's going to tell Isaac, hey, we need to send Jacob off to my brother Laban back in the east, back up at Nahor, which was called Haran, and let him choose a wife so that he won't do what Esau did and go to these Canaanites and Hittites and choose a wife. But in her deception, she was really trying to say, let's send Jacob off because Esau's going to kill him. So they send Jacob off. Now, we have some misconceptions about Jacob. We want to think of Jacob in his deception as being a shrewd, crude guy. We read in the Bible that he was different than Esau, so they're making a comparison. Esau was a hunter. Esau was a wild man. Esau was hairy, red, and crazy. But Jacob was gentle, and Rebekah liked him more. Isaac, who wasn't a wild man, who didn't do very much, wished he could have, and so he was living his life through Esau. So they send Jacob off. You know the story. Jacob was caught in this classic scene of conflict between his parents. Isaac was not a towering figure like we said in the scriptures. He wasn't an Abraham, but God can use a mediocre man to fulfill his plan, as we see. Probably he did not command much respect from Rebekah. For her to come up with the plan that she did, maybe not. The tension between them manifested itself into raising of their twin boys, and Isaac preferred the manly, and Rebekah preferred the shrewder Jacob. But Jacob he didn't sit around on a computer all day. He wasn't in the basement in his underwear. He was just like everybody else there. He knew about sheep. He knew about goats. He knew about cows. He was very adept in that, and you're going to see that later. The intrigue in the household would have made a great soap opera. After stealing his father's blessing, which he had been intended for his brother, Jacob is forced to flee to Haran. On the way, he stops at a place called Bethel. And he has a dream. A ladder which rises up into heaven. There Jacob makes a deal with God. He's a deal maker, a wheeler dealer, would have been great on Wall Street. He makes a deal with God. And listen to this prayer. Oh God, if you will be with me and give me things I desire, classy home, fashionable car, beautiful wife, bright, healthy children, 100 shares of Apple stock, then you can be my God. Okay, wasn't quite like that, but you get the idea. How many times have you said to God, God, if you get me out of this, I promise I'll never do it again. God, if you'll just be with me, I promise that I'll walk the straight and narrow. Soon you get me out of this situation. We made those promises all along. Well, Jacob did too. And he was still striving. That's what his name means, to strive. He was competing in this world, but all of a sudden something's about to change. Jacob was striving, still competing, still determined to be number one, but this time he was bargaining with God. Something was changing in Jacob all of a sudden. Jacob is not just striving against the world, he was striving against God. Why does that make a difference? You know, what makes a difference is Jacob realized that he had a soul. Have you realized you have a soul? Are you doing anything about it? Your soul is the most important part of you. So Jacob leaves Bethel, heads on up actually to Haran, where he stops. He thinks he's in the area of his uncle Laban. So Jacob's standing by this well, and there's a big stone rolled over the well. And all the shepherds with their flocks are standing there waiting. And Jacob says, hey, guys, what are you waiting on? He said, well, we wait till everybody gets here, and then we all together roll the stone back. And Jacob says, hey, by the way, do you know my uncle Laban? Oh, yeah, they all knew him. He's a big guy in town. All of a sudden, here comes Laban's flock. And who's leading it? The most beautiful girl Jacob has ever seen. Her name was Rachel. And she rolls up, and Jacob gets so pumped up, he moved the rock by himself. And they watered their sheep and goats. He goes over and he talks to Rebecca, and he tells her who he is, that he's a relative, and what the plan is, and, you know, and she runs back and tells Laban. Laban comes out and gets him. Says, this is great. We got relatives in town. They have a couple of nights and days of talk about what's gone on with everybody and where everybody is and what's happening. And then Laban says, what's your plans? And so he says, well, I'll stick around for a while. And so he did. And in a couple of months, Laban says, hey, you've been working for nothing. What's your plans? What's your wage? What's your wages? What do I have to pay you to do what you're doing? Jacob says, you give me Rachel as my wife, and I will work for you 7 years. Laban says, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And so off they go. And Laban was ecstatic because Laban knew that God was with Jacob, because all of a sudden he started to prosper. He had more sheep. He had more goats. He had more cows. He had all kinds of things. He was growing, and he liked it. The 7 years went really fast. The Bible says it was like just a few days. It felt like because Jacob was just head over heels for Rachel. 7 years are up. He's fulfilled his obligation. He wants his wages. So they have a big wedding feast, big party. And all of a sudden, you find out that Laban is about as shrewd as Jacob. Laban then decides, okay, it's time for the wedding feast. And it became evening, dark. So Jacob gives his daughter, and here goes Laban gives his daughter. Here goes Jacob into the tent. He thinks that he's consummating his marriage with Rachel. Now, you got to ask yourself these questions. How could this be that Laban had substituted Leah, his oldest daughter, in the place of Rachel? How did Jacob not know that? Could it be that they, were the same height, same hair color? Maybe they even sounded alike. But they said that there was a difference in the Bible. It said there was a difference between the two. And one was that Rachel was beautiful. Leah was okay. So, could he have mistaken that? Or in the festivities of the night, did he have too much to drink? Or was it that the wedding garb that Leah was in concealed who she was? Whatever happened, and the Bible only says this happened, it was dark. Electricity wasn't on in the tent. In other words, he couldn't see her. But he saw her next morning, and he was hot. He went to Laban and says, "What have you done to me?" Laban says, "Oh, cool off. This is the way we do it down here. The oldest has to be married off first before the youngest one can be married." What do you think Jacob did? He didn't get mad anymore. He said, okay, 7 years. But what we skipped was, I always thought that he waited 7 more years to marry Rachel. Nah, 1 week. He had 1 week, and then he got to marry Rachel. Now he has 2 wives. And so, I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story because you can read it. I mean, it was unbelievable the things that Jacob did for Laban. Oh, Laban was really happy about it because he was getting richer and richer. But Jacob was getting rich too. They were big time in the sheep, cows, goats, camels, donkeys, all those things. But there was something going on. There was something burning in Jacob. For one thing, he wanted to go home. He had some unfinished business there. But there was also some other unfinished business of which he was aware, or he was not aware, but he couldn't put a name to it either. That unfinished business was with God. We see the great hunger satisfied at a place he would later call Putnian. Now, in your Bible, it may spell that Peniel, which doesn't sound like that at all. But I looked it up, and in the Hebrew, the way they say it is Putnian. Doesn't make any sense to me, but if it looks like Peniel to you, that's fine. Anyway, Jacob had started back home, and Laban came after him because Rachel and Leah decided they'd take some of Laban's other gods and put them in and carry them along with them. I don't know why they wanted them. Maybe they wanted to torture Laban. But all that got settled. God wasn't going to let anything happen to Jacob at that point anyway. Business was settled. Laban is behind him now, but there's something in front of Jacob, something that's still burning inside of him. Name's Esau. That night, Jacob camped by a brook, and all night long he wrestled with God. Have you ever spent the night wrestling with God? Have you ever spent the night with something on your mind you can't get it off? Something you need to do or didn't do or want to do? Perhaps Jacob was wrestling with regret about his past dealings with his brother Esau. I don't know if you call them past dealings or not, but he stole a bunch of money from Esau, which was his inheritance. So Jacob formed this plan as he was over this brook of Jabbok, and it was just before you go in across the Jordan River into where he was headed, because out of the east comes Esau. So Jacob sends a bunch of his cows and animals out in front and in two waves, and he splits his company up in case Esau attacks one, the others could get away. Then he brings all of his kids, Leah's kids. Hey, Leah had a bunch of kids. I mean, she had 6 of the 12 of the tribe of Israel. 6. Anyway, they were next, and then his precious Rachel was in the rear with her son Joseph. So he's got people out front, he's got people in the rear, they're back across the river, and he's camped out by himself. And that's when he starts this wrestling with God. You see, we think that it's Jesus that has come in the form of a pre-incarnated Christ. But Jacob's wrestling with him, and he's afraid. Jacob's conflict with Esau was not unusual. Esau was his brother, and Jacob was reaching, the twilight of his life. Marcus Cato, the great Roman statesman who lived over 2,000 years ago, once said, "I can pardon everybody's mistakes but my own." Benjamin Franklin toward the end of his life, said that he has such a good life that he could do it again. He would run again from the beginning to the end, the same career of his life. All he would ask would be the privilege of the author to correct the second edition of certain errors of the first. Is there any of us who would not make some correction in the second edition if we had to do it over again? It is not unusual for a person to lie awake at night regretting past mistakes. We would do well to heed the words of the unknown poet. Stand out in the sunlight of promise, forgetting whatever the past held of sorrow or wrong. We waste half our strength in useless regretting. We sit by old tombs in the dark too long. Perhaps Jacob wrestled with God. He was wrestling with the dark ghost of regret over those unfortunate misdeeds of yesterday. And they were many, and more to come. On the other hand, it could have been anxiety of future events that was keeping him awake. Well, Esau was on the way. You know, Dr. John Schindler did a study that said 50% of all the people going to doctors today in the United States are victims of one disease, one malady. He calls it a psychoneurosis, and he identifies the cause as acute anxiety. When Sir Walter Raleigh was burdened with a huge debt, his doctor told him, Sir Walter, if you don't stop worrying, you're going to die. Sir Walter looked up sadly and said, I can't help worrying as long as that debt is over my head. It may kill me, but you might as well tell my cook to order the water in the kettle not to boil as to command my brain not to worry. Perhaps it was acute anxiety with which Jacob was wrestling. After all, his brother Esau was heading toward him with 400 men. He could not know Esau's intentions. It's interesting how often guilt about the past is part of anxiety of the future. Besides, time was moving very quickly, and for Jacob, as it does for all of us, he was no spring chicken anymore. What would happen to his family if he was incapacitated or even dead? Even if brother Esau didn't get him eventually, Father Time would. There comes that time in a man's life when he starts asking such questions. What about the dimming eyesight? What about the faltering step? The strivers of life, like Laban and Jacob, they don't age very well. A man who has spent 2 decades trying to look like a teenager has a difficult task accepting the ravages of time. That is why mental health professionals predict an epidemic of suicides, the baby boomers, as baby boomers enter life's later years. What about the issue of death? Woody Allen once said that he was not afraid of dying. He just didn't want to be there when it happened. How's that working out, Woody? Jacob had a lot to think about as he lay there beside that brook. Perhaps it was anxiety about the future with which Jacob wrestled that fateful night. Or even more likely, perhaps it was the issue of Jacob's whole relationship with God that kept him awake that night. Jacob didn't realize it, but he and God still had some unfinished business. Sorry about that. At Bethel, Jacob had prayed arrogantly. If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go and will give me bread to eat and clothes to put on so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. However, Jacob didn't pray that prayer again. He had a different prayer this time. Esau was headed toward him, and he prayed to God. He said, "Oh God, I am not worthy of the least of these mercies." Something profound was happening in Jacob's life. It was more than fear of his brother. It had to do with the recognition of who God is and who we as human beings are. For Jacob, it culminated in this wrestling match at the brook. Jacob had always been a competitor, a striver with man and with God. In the language of TV commercials, it might be like this. He knew where he was going. He knew what he wanted. He was determined to do what he needed to do in order to get there. He would be in control. He would master his possibilities. The sky was the limit. You do not know what's available until you strive like that, he says to himself. Do you know anybody like that? They have always been with us. Men and women determined to grab the gusto of life that's offered them. And when they do, they discover themselves standing holding a handful of foam, but nothing real lasting. Jacob needed something more. He needed an overall purpose in his life. He needed to understand the overall scheme of things and where his life fit in. Suddenly he saw that his life was better than half over, and he thought it was important that he didn't eventually just become dust, that he did something. What does all that mean? It's the who am I? Really, who am I? Does my life really matter? As Jacob wrestled with God that night, the encounter was so demanding that God touched his hip and it went out of place. One thinks of Jesus kneeling in the Garden of Gethsemane with the drops of sweat like great drops of blood falling from his brow. This was the kind of encounter that Jacob had. From this day forward, he would never be the same. For you see, Jacob needed more than anything else in his life to understand that God was the master of the universe and not Jacob. It's interesting that being with whom Jacob wrestles God does not prevail over Jacob. Why? He could. See, God looked at Jacob like he was this big stallion, grand stallion. And it wasn't God's desire that Jacob grovel at his feet. God has no use for one who continually grovels. God wanted a grand stallion, but one who could be useful, one who could be saddled, one who would know who is master, that he might fulfill his master's intended purpose. That is what God desires from us as well. Our lives are useful only to ourselves and only for a season if we refuse to give God the reins. The writer of Genesis closes this chapter in Jacob's life with a beautiful picture. It's a picture of a limping Jacob preparing to meet his brother Esau. He is no longer afraid. Remember what God spoke to Rachel? He said to her, there's going to be problems with these two, and the younger will rule the older. After all, Jacob had wrestled all night with God. How can he fear a mere mortal? But now he's a new Jacob. He even has a new name. God gave him the name Israel. The children, can you remember this? The children, the Jews that are in Israel now are the children of Jacob. It's not like I'm an Israelite, I'm a Jacobite. Jacob will become a prince after this among men. Forever his descendants, millions of them, will be known as the children of Israel. As the sun rises over this place, Jacob stands up, dislocated hip, indicating his brokenness. Yet he is stronger than he's ever been before. His life is now aligned with the eternal purposes of God. How about you? Have you been wrestling with God? Isn't it time to let him be the sovereign over your life? There is a story about a man who had misspent his life. A friend was teasing him. He says, "Hey, John, you still wrestling with that old devil?" John said, "Nowadays, I spend most of my time wrestling with God." And his friend said, "Wrestling with God? How do you hope to win a wrestling match with God?" And John smiles and answers, Oh, you misunderstand. In this wrestling match, I'm hoping to lose. Jacob changed. Why? Because Jacob found out that some things are loved because they are valuable, but some things are valuable because they are loved. Take from that what you will, but remember this: God loves you, He always has, and He always will. Everybody said, Amen.
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 That was a good lesson.
Thank you.
I thought you were going to tie it into today's stuff, though.
Coming next week.
Next week.
Next week. The sequel.
Sequel. This is the ever-growing soap opera, if you can believe it.
And it gets more involved every week.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, what's going to happen here.
Yeah.
Isaac goes out and does the same thing his father did. He lied about Rebecca. He told Abimelech that she was his sister. Same results, same thing happened. He goes off with a bunch of money, and because God punched out Abimelech, and he squealed. That's the same story Abraham pulled off. It just seems like it keeps moving down here. And it's all because of those daggone beautiful women.
And so the story begins.
Promise that you're here to stay.